This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 10, entitled Consequences of Globa, part 3 from my second book, Multis and Monos, What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured Towards the Creation of a Global State. This is just continuing straight on. This is section J, called Global Boredom. If only the most popular ideas and values survive, leading to a global cultural homogenization, won't that create a more boring and limited global culture than one consisting, as is the case at the time of writing, that was 2007, it's now as I read this aloud, 2017, 10 years later, of many diverse and heterogeneous cultures? From my own perspective, I love touristing. I love travelling around seeing different cultures, customs, ideas, etc., as well as spectacular natural sights, such as the Grand Canyon in the US, the Alps in Europe, etc. In a globally homogeneous culture, by definition, no matter where one goes, one will be confronted with the same global culture. There will be no variety, very few differences. That will make tourism more boring. It will be like touring the US, where in every sizable city one sees the same damn chain stores in the same American shopping malls, for example, McDonald's, Walmart, etc. For the tourist, travelling around the US is a culturally deadening experience. The chain stores of the US have homogenized the country. In fact, it's a common US national policy of the chain stores to install a new branch whenever a town grows to the size of a city, that is, over 100,000 people. I saw this happen myself when living in a relatively small town in the US, whose regional population went over the 100,000 threshold, and then suddenly an invasion of the chain stores occurred. Dozens of them were built in a few years, changing the town of course, but making it the same as thousands of other towns/cities in the US. These same chain store companies are now doing the same internationally. For example, Walmart is installing hundreds of stores in China, where I currently live. It's an example of the cultural homogenization of the planet, although in this case on the commercial physical side of life. Glow media, however, is more on the psychological intellectual side of life. I do think that global cultural homogenization will make life more boring for the global tourist, at least culturally speaking. Of course, the natural wonders of the world to be seen will not disappear. In fact, due to glow media, they will be better advertised around the world. As a relatively affluent tourist living in China, I get to see many spectacular natural Chinese sights that the Chinese government has not yet marketed to the world, so that the world does not see them nor even knows about them. I'm talking about sights that are not quite as spectacular as America's Grand Canyon, but not a lot less spectacular. In time, the world will come to know about them and to see such sights and be awed by them. The same logic will apply to such sights all around the world. So global tourism will not suffer as a result of global cultural homogenization. Culturally speaking, world tourism will become more boring, but the natural sights of the world will more than make up for that, given its huge variety, and that so many of them have yet to be exploited. K. Knowledge gap. You can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. Similarly, you can give glow media to the masses, but only a minority of them will make full use of it. Most people will probably be content to play their mindless computer games, watch their pop song idols, and generally continue to lead their benighted little lives. But the intellectuals, sages as I call them, the curious, the bright young kids, will jump at the opportunities offered by glow media. They will absorb the lessons that glow media has to offer and will be profoundly changed by it. They will become multis, globans, and feel a growing knowledge gap and attitude gap between themselves and the masses. In short, a glow media-based knowledge gap will be created that will divide society. The more intellectual, brighter portions of the world's population will have its horizons extended to the global scale, while the less intellectual, dumber portion will remain more or less stuck in its narrow little lives, lacking the curiosity and intellectual hunger to explore the vastly superior range of possibilities. As a result of this knowledge gap, a corresponding class and intelligence gap will be created, leading to social frictions between the classes. Those people with expanded globist, glomediad minds will become more impatient and contemptuous of the nationalist monomediad minds. The latter will feel the contempt and resent it. A backlash will probably arise, and that may slow the globification process. The globists will need to be careful not to push too fast and too hard. The traditionalists will not like having their traditional lifestyles pulled from under them. This will make them feel very disturbed, uprooted, disoriented, alienated and unhappy, and they will fight back. The globists will have to factor in such conservative resistance in their plans to globify the planet. They will have to take into account the growing knowledge gap and related gaps. L. Generation gap. As just mentioned, the younger generation will very probably adapt to glomedia far more quickly and readily than will the older generations. The young generation has to absorb an initial set of cultural ideas and values anyway as part of its maturation process, so it will be forced to make the effort to acculturate. The older generation, by definition, has already been through this process, and since it takes years of effort and time to absorb a culture's ideas and norms, the older generation will not be enthusiastic about having to do the same thing all over again. As a case in point, take the example of a middle generation migrant who has children and who brings over his parents to live in the new, richer country. For example, imagine a Hungarian in the 1950s migrating to Canada or the US or Australia. Typically, the migrant's children will learn the new language within a year and be fluent. The migrant himself will take a few years longer. His parents, however, may never get fluent, preferring to devote their time and energies in the language and values of their pre-migration lives. They have already devoted so many years of their lives building up a rich repertoire of knowledge, ideas, customs, and values in their childhood culture that they are unwilling to just throw it overboard. That would be such a waste. I'm a classic case of this. At the time of writing, I'll turn 60. So remember this was written 10 years ago, so I've recently turned 70. Back to the book. I spend most of my time doing Western pursuits, like reading modern new science texts in English, to lecture to my Chinese graduate students in my role as a professor, and in writing books in English, a language that I have taken a lifetime to master. But I'm living in China. I should be plunging into learning the language with its tens of thousands of words and thousands of Chinese characters so that I can absorb the country's great cultural and historical richness. I do intend to do this. Ad-libbing now? No way. I'm fed up with this culture. I'm out of here in about a year or so. But right now, I'm caught in a battle of priorities for my time, that precious commodity that older people value so highly because they know they have too little of it left. So, as the world homogenizes culturally, as glow media works its magic, it's likely that a generation gap will grow. The younger generation will adapt to the greater potential of a global state far more quickly and readily than will the older generations, resulting in a clash of attitudes and expectations between the generations. This has always been the case, but the globification process will only exacerbate the process. Suddenly, in a technological development that will take only a few years, as BRAD, bit rate annual doubling, allows glow media to truly come into being, glow media will be established and be a fait accompli, which the world will have to come to terms with. The young will accept it as they accept anything they find in the world that they are recently born into. If babies regularly saw objects falling upwards into the sky all the time, they would find that perfectly natural. Their brains would come to expect it. The middle generation will be curious about it and make the effort to learn about its incredible potential. The old generation will probably groan and complain about yet another major technological revolution that demands their attention and effort, along with the recent computer revolution, emails, the internet, etc. The generation gap is to be expected, but I doubt it will be too severe. The sheer fascination of glow media will mean that even the old generation will be intrigued by its immediacy and be motivated to explore it. I doubt in practice the generation gap created by the presence of glow media will prove to be a major handicap. The attractions of glow media will be simply too great for any generation to ignore. M. Global dictatorship? I've noticed correlations between attitudes towards the idea of a global state, global government, global culture and global language on the one hand, and the nationality of the people I'm talking to about these ideas. For example, the Americans are much more likely to be cynical of the idea of a global state than are Europeans. The Americans are more likely to be fearful of the possibility of the creation of a global dictatorship if a global state were technologically possible than are Europeans. My impression is that Americans do not admire politicians as much as Europeans do. To Americans, politicians tend to be incompetent, corrupt, and unscrupulous, which then sets up a vicious circle. Those people who are highly competent, honest, and caring tend not to go into American politics, so that by default, those who do reinforce the American stereotype. A vicious circle is established. In Europe, politicians have a better public image. They tend to be seen as being more intellectual, more bookish, more philosophical, and more sophisticated. Hence they are more respected by the European public. This sets up a virtuous, positive circle, whereby the more sophisticated, intellectual, and philosophical minds are attracted into European politics. So which of these two attitudes towards global government is more likely to prove to be correct over time? There's a lot at stake here. No one wants to live in a global dictatorship. Imagine if a global Mao came into power and killed 300 million people trying to stay in power. That number of people is roughly equal to the number of people who died in all the wars, purges, genocides and holocausts of the whole of the 20th century. It would be a total disaster. The risks of such a disaster explain the American distrust towards the creation of a global state. The Europeans, however, are much more optimistic about the prospect of the creation of a global state, largely because it is they who are making it happen. The Americans are too stuck in their 19th century nationalism, religiosity, and militarism to be the pioneers of the creation of a post-national political era. However, I've heard Americans say, "We Americans are 2 centuries ahead of you Europeans with your EU, European Union. In the late 1800s, we formed a union of states." In the late 1700s, we formed a union of states called the United States of America, which went on to become the dominant nation on Earth. There is some truth to this claim, of course, but Europeans could quickly retort that what the US is doing today would be the equivalent what the EU is doing today would be the equivalent of the US today joining forces economically and politically with the other 30-odd countries of North, Central and South America to form the UA, that is the Union of Americas, with its capital in Rio. There is some truth to this claim too, of course. The Europeans are more confident about the creation of a global state, not only because they are pioneering its creation, although many EU citizens do not see the EU as a stepping stone towards the creation of Globa, ad-libbing, particularly the Brits. Look at Brexit, the exit of Britain from the EU. Back to the book. But because the global state, if created by Europeans, would very definitely be democratic, and therefore very unlikely to be susceptible to being taken over by a would-be dictator. Democracy was created in Europe, and democratic values are deeply ingrained in the European mentality, despite temporary lapses in the cases of Hitler, 12 years, Mussolini, about 20 years, and Franco, about 35 years. The Europeans are building the EU, which may very well prove to be the essential route to creating Globa. If some future politician attempting to manipulate global institutions towards the goal of forming a global dictatorship, I just can't imagine the Europeans, nor the Americans for that matter, tolerating it. Globa will be intrinsically, essentially, fundamentally a democratic institution. No dictatorship will be allowed to join it in a way that is similar to the way that no country can join the EU if it is a dictatorship. If the EU is the stepping stone towards the creation of Globa, then that path, at every step, will be democratic. Since most democracies are rich, and no rich country in history has reverted to dictatorship, as far as I know, it is, in my opinion, and probably the opinions of millions of other people, that it's highly unlikely that Globa could be corrupted into a dictatorship. I just don't see it happening, unless something really major occurs, such as the rise of the Artilect problem that I discussed in Chapter 9. That is the end of Chapter 10.